today I thought that we would keep it a little bit lighthearted, but take a look at the overall music industry as it stands today. Where are we? And I put it in the context of the music industry Hunger Games, winners and losers. So welcome to the music industry Hunger Games, where the music industry combatants vie bravely for the piece of an ever-shrinking pie. You may recognize this quote from Hunter S. Thompson. How many people have seen this quote before? The music business is a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free and good men die like dogs. There's also a negative side. This quote from Hunter S. Thompson actually has become the description of the music industry, but never before has it been more appropriate than now, because it's the Wild West out there, folks. The difference between the old music business and the new one is quite stark, because technology has not only disrupted the traditional music business model, it has virtually subsumed it. At the turn of the last century, and that's the 20th century, it would have been difficult to imagine the YouTube explosion, the rapid ascendancy of mobile phone apps, their usage, their creation. And it would have been hard to imagine the impact that these disruptive technologies would have on the music industry as it now stands. Also, because this technological revolution occurred so quickly, with very little warning, in many cases, the law has yet to catch up to any meaningful degree. So when we're looking at this, what are the rules? We know there are certain rules, and they do exist out there, and people should follow them, but is anyone really paying attention to them? And are there many conflicting rules now? For one thing, let's take a look. Copyright enforcement in the music industry has had its problems, to say the least. We know about that. Copyright stakeholders playing global whack-a-mole with piracy sites over the last decade or so. The labels selectively enforcing their copyright interests. For example, they're threatening the likes of Ms. Lenz, who had a 27-second video on YouTube, and suing Ms. Thomas Rassett, while allowing Greg Gillis of Girl Talk to get away with mashing up thousands of those same label sound recordings with nary a legal peep. And this makes for a pocked enforcement landscape, in my opinion. And on the other side of the street, we have hip-hop artists, we have DJs, EDM artists, and other artists are ripping off sound recordings and compositions from vast numbers of not only major label artists and taking the label sound recordings, but also independent artists. And the independent artists simply don't have the resource to redress these infringements. So, on the other hand, as a result of free streaming services and the advent of the cloud, illegal downloading has pretty much hit a wall. A study released in late 2013 by networking company Sandvine on internet traffic, they found that peer-to-peer traffic is now below 10%. That's down 31% from 5 years ago and down 60% from 11 years ago. And the thought is that less P2P traffic translates to less piracy. And some reports are showing that as well. And we can take a look at YouTube. Let's just take a look at YouTube. YouTube is now the go-to platform for consuming music for US teens, according to Nielsen's annual Music 360 report. There's more than 64% of teens consume their music that way. And it's free, essentially, and legal. So are the major labels, the tech companies, the telecoms, all of these players playing by the rules? Well, it's hard to know because if no one knows exactly what they are, it makes them a little bit hard to follow. So in the music industry Hunger Games, right now, what are the hard and fast rules? We really don't know, and we don't know as a result who are going to be the winners and losers. So let's take a look at the players and see how they all fit into this. Well, first, before we do that, we're going to take a look at the weapons. What are the weapons in the music industry Hunger Games? This is hard for me, folks, to do this, so I'm getting the weapons. But I think these are pretty descriptive of what's going on here. In the music industry Hunger Games arsenal, these are the things that people are using. And they can be wielded by many different kinds of music industry participants. The question, however, is, are they effective? Let's take a look. Subscription and non-subscription services. Are these weapons used by or used against the artists? The labels, the publishers, the consumers. Crowdfunding, or better known as fan funding. This is a weapon that is wielded by artists to keep the labels at bay from confiscating their property via the ubiquitous 360-degree deal, or broad rights deal as we refer to them. But do artists actually know how to handle this weapon once they have it? Licensing. Are these weapons for the publishers? Or are they weapons for the music users? There are more music users than ever, we know that, but there's more cheap and available music than ever as well. So the licensing explosion and musical bounty have been forged into a two-edged sword. Digital distribution. Are these weapons for the artist/songwriter to get to their fans? Or are they really a weapon with a dull blade? No doubt, the ability of artists to directly reach their fan bases via digital distribution was and remains a significant weapon in the music industry Hunger Games. But did it really level the playing field as it was supposed to do? And finally, the internet and the law. Are these weapons for tech companies to sue for lower rates? Weapons against copyright infringers, for copyright owners to use, weapons for large telecoms to impose fast and slow lanes on the internet, which will have an effect on the music industry. The law as a weapon, as we know, has been wielded by all, or really should I say by those who can afford this massively expensive weapon. With battles engaged, for example, between Sirius XM radio and the labels and artists over pre-1972 recording licenses, to the Pandora PRO scuffles, to the artists who were waging insurgencies based on their termination rights, and so many others in which this weapon has been used, the war certainly rages on. So let's take a look. Label. Is the record label a winner, or is the record label a loser in these Hunger Games? For a long time, more than a decade, it looked like the labels were going to be complete losers. But is this still true today? Well, let's take a look. On the losing side, it's no secret that the recording industry as we knew it is failing. The net value of pre-recorded music product as a standalone sales item is rapidly approaching statistically zero. CD sales have plunged by more than half from 2003 to the present, and the net value of the music industry itself is 50% of what it was in 2003. In fact, CD sales are down to just 30% of music industry sales revenues. Another sobering statistic which amplifies this, the top 10 selling albums in the United States shifted 56.4 million units in the year 2000. But by 2013, the number shifted was 14.7 million units. So it's widely accepted at this point that such pre-recorded music products will never again regain any discrete monetary value based on individual or per unit sales. Unfortunately, standalone music product sales have been the core revenue stream for record labels since their inception, and this is no longer the case. Also, on the losing side, which is also a losing side for artists, we'll get to that, the steep decline in record sales, coupled with several major record label mergers that have occurred over the last 10 years, shrinking the industry, has caused record labels to not only terminate hundreds of recording artist agreements, but also has caused the major labels, and really any labels, to be extremely cautious and reluctant to sign agreements with new and untried artists. There is a winning side to this. Labels are managing to keep their heads above water by licensing their enormous sound recording catalogs to subscription services such as Spotify. The interests of the major labels and the streaming services are actually very similar. The major labels' fortunes, as they may be, are firmly embedded and wedded with technology and telecommunications companies at this point. Major labels have actually gained interest in these companies over the past few years. The original model was the upfront licensing model, wherein the labels focused more on large upfront guarantees or advances in exchange for the rights of these streaming services to use their valuable catalogs. But that has shifted. Spotify, for example, not only pays the label huge multi-million-dollar advances, but now they pay them equity interests as well. They actually have equity interests in these companies. So now it is said that major labels own approximately a 20% equity interest in Spotify, for example. These equity percentages are awarded in exchange for the content licensing, and they can reap great rewards. Let's look at Beats Music. Everybody knows, hopefully, that Beats Music was just sold to Apple for $3.2 billion. Universal Music Group, who had an interest in Beats, received $404 million from the sale of Beats to Apple. Unfortunately, UMG may need it when all of those class action suits are finally settled in the wake of the FBT versus Aftermath decision, but that's another story, that whole debacle. But what's happened here is because the major labels have this equity interest now in a service as big as Spotify, they're pushing for a sale of Spotify. And they're pushing for it north of $10 billion, it's reported. So the shift from the upfront payments for licensing to the equity model is a result of some rethinking by the major labels on how they can and will in the future profit from streaming services, because the labels simply realize there's a market for acquisition now, perhaps by a major telecom company, maybe Verizon or Time Warner or even Comcast. So if Spotify and the other services have exits as lucrative as the fledgling Beats Music did, where a large investor purchases the entity, then the payouts to the major labels will be quite generous. So that is on the winning side. And then on the other winning side, you could say, as an outgrowth of the issue that CD sales have declined so precipitously, came this 360-degree deal, which I'm sure most of you have dealt with, or broad rights deal, whatever you want to call it right now. But it really is a must sign if an artist, especially a mid-level artist, wants a major label deal at this point. Does everybody know what a 360 deal is? Everybody kind of knows what this is, how it entails requiring their exclusive recording artists to relinquish some percentage of any and all revenue streams, in addition to the royalty payments based on record sales. So the label's not only going to receive its traditionally large percentage of record sales, but many other streams of revenue as well. And I'm sure all of us in this room here have seen some deals that we've looked at and gone like this and said, this is the most onerous thing I've ever seen, to sometimes they're relatively fair. So they really go all over the place at this point. But it is kind of a win for the labels in that they have figured out a way to pull away from the CD sales and tithe, if you will, these other percentage streams, sometimes in perpetuity, sometimes they want them in perpetuity. A U.S. district judge made a ruling against SiriusXM Radio, saying that it violated recording artists Flo and Eddie. Flo and Eddie they were recording artists with a band called the Turtles, and they existed in the 1960s, and they owned rights to their master recordings, and they sued SiriusXM because what they wanted to do was get a license from SiriusXM to play their pre-1972 recordings, which are not covered by the current Copyright Act. So the district judge actually ruled against SiriusXM and saying that it violated Flo and Eddie's recording rights by playing the Turtles records without a license. And as I said, these masters, these Turtles masters, were created pre-1972, and so under that construct, they're governed by California state law. Now, interestingly, California state law, as it's written, the judge interpreted property right to mean that it gave the master recording owner exclusive performance rights. It interpreted the term exclusive ownership to mean that whoever owned a piece of property had the right to use it and enjoy it and do what they wanted with it, alienate it, whatever. And the judge said, well, a use is public performance, so therefore these recording artists have, under California state law, the public performance right, exclusive public performance right. There was another segment of this particular suit, but he did not reach that. The court did not reach that. But at least in California right now, it's possible that labels have another one in the win column, because now Sirius XM may have to pay for the use, the performances of all of these new sound recordings now coming under this California ruling, but everybody feels that it's going to be appealed, and also it's on a state-by-state basis, because these pre-1972s are under state law, they're not under federal law. So, but again, this speaks to the uncertainty of the law. This really speaks to the uncertainty of the law. I don't think it's time to freak out yet, but some people are. Okay, so let's take a look at the artist. It was always an uphill climb for music artists to gain an audience, whether they were within or without the corporate music industry structure. And the new technologies have not really significantly altered that tenet. But the technological methods that an artist must now master and employ, the absence of a financial support structure, the economic education now required to keep track of revenues, and the social media acumen that's necessary for a musical artist to find her audience has created a new paradigm for both nation and established artist development. Let's start by saying this. The average musician is severely underemployed, which you probably can guess. But there was a musician survey that was conducted by the Future of Music Coalition, which, by the way, if you want to get some interesting news, Future Music Coalition is a lobbying organization, essentially, for recording artists' rights. They work also with low-power FM radio and many other issues of the day, and they do a tremendous amount of research. So futureofmusic.org if you're interested in looking at it. But anyway, they conducted this survey, and they found just 42% of musicians are working full-time in music. The rest are complementing their day jobs with, other things that have little or nothing to do with music. And worse, actually, musicians' salaries are intractably low. According to this FMC survey, the average musician makes around $34,000 a year from music-specific gigs, and with overall incomes, meaning music plus non-music incomes, averaging around $55,000. So what's the winning side for artists here? Well, let's take a look at these streaming services again. You probably know, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself and you already know this, but there are two kinds of streaming services. There's the interactive streaming service, and there is the non-interactive streaming service. So non-interactive services such as Sirius XM and Music Choice are covered by the Copyright Act's compulsory statutory licenses, which I'm sure that you know this. Pandora, I always thought Pandora was a crazy outlier in a way, even though it's been classified as a non-interactive service. It's kind of semi-interactive. You can't really select your own songs, but you can select your own artists, which then will lead to certain songs, but you can't pick those songs. So they've been classified as non-interactive. In general, these licenses for non-interactive streaming services where the listener cannot pick the song, essentially, they've been good for the independent music label community and for the artists as well, because all music label copyrights, whether they're owned by an independent artist or whether they're owned by a major label, it doesn't matter. They're all treated equally under the compulsory stat license. And they're paid the same rate amount, in other words, for each stream or play of that music. Those rates are set by the Copyright Royalty Board of the CRB, and they're administered by Sound Exchange, which I'm sure you all know. The authority, though, of Sound Exchange to aggressively pursue the best possible statutory rates and handle all the administration, including processing and auditing, which is, it's a lot, let's face it, that results in having one central group that can protect independent artists' rights, independent music labels' rights, as well as others, of course. As the statutory rate seems to be working, and indie labels are benefiting a lot, as well as indie artists are benefiting from having this sort of one central voice to speak for them. The other thing on the winning side is internet radio of all stripes seems to be growing a lot. Within 9 years, Pandora has established itself as a major radio network with 77 million listeners. It's huge. And more than 9% of the total US radio listening as of May in 2014, it's reported. And in a deal that Pandora signed with Merlin, does everybody know what Merlin is? Merlin is an organization that was started overseas for independent record labels, much like the Recording Industry Association of America is for major record labels here in the United States. Merlin serves the interests for independent record labels. And independent artists as well. Right now, Merlin has 20,000 plus independent labels. And they just signed a deal with Pandora, where the internet radio service committed itself to helping newer artists get discovered. Because as you can well imagine, Pandora has many discovery techniques, many analytics, a lot of information gathering that would be helpful for the artist to increase exposure to her fans. The artist could rely on Pandora's playback data to decide on set lists. The artist could rely on this data to pinpoint tour locations even. So that's a really good thing. That's a positive win for the artist to be able to tap into that resource. On another note, TuneIn, which is another major radio aggregate in the internet space, what they're trying to do is to connect traditional radio stations, artists, and podcasters with their fans and create a platform where hosts and listeners can directly communicate with one another. So there is some kind of symbiotic relationship now that is now emerging between the artist, the indie artists, and these internet non-interactive services. But there is a losing side, of course. And this could be on the interactive side. For music streaming services that are not covered by compulsory stat licenses like Spotify, or those that have an audiovisual component or allow some kind of greater consumer activity to select the songs, create playlists, a direct license is required between the music service and the sound recording copyright owner. These services may equally be valuable to the independent music label and artist community. However, the caveat here is that the deal terms are a little bit trickier, and that translates to less money for the independent artist and less money for the independent label. While the compensation packages under these agreements generically might include a combination of a per stream rate, maybe some revenue sharing, equity in the service, a minimum guarantee or a minimum advance. For the major labels, the indie labels, and when I talk about indie labels, I'm talking about indie artists too, because a lot of indie artists own their own labels. They're given a lot of short shrift here. This means that this truly does translate into less participation for the independent community in this trickle-down sort of label world. It doesn't mean, though, that the major label artists necessarily fare any better, because if an artist has a major label deal, if the advance or minimum guarantees exceed the amount earned during the licensing period, the label will earn what's called digital breakage. Has anybody ever heard that term before, digital breakage? Digital breakage is, let me give you an example, and I think this will come clear. It's an advance. You know how artists get advance in recording artist deals, and then they're non-refundable prepayment of royalties, essentially. So if the artist does not make the royalty, they can get to keep the remainder of that advance. Okay, generally speaking, this is a very general matter. This is kind of the same thing, where the record label will get this upfront payment, some minimum guarantee or minimum advance, and if during the licensing period, the streaming revenues only reap, let's say, half of what that advance is, then the label gets to keep that, and that's called breakage. Artists don't participate in the breakage, which, by the way, is a negotiating point that we should all be looking at as attorneys when we negotiate these recording artist agreements now, is including digital breakage in them. So the other thing is, we talked earlier about buyouts. What happens if a buyout of one of these major technology companies like Spotify does occur and the major label has an equity interest in it? Does the artist get anything for that? Oh, no. The artist will not see the benefit of that right now. Anyway, this is the way the landscape is right now. Hopefully that will change. And even worse, Spotify is suspected, and people are looking into this, of completely misrepresenting its per stream payout structure based on discrepancies with extremely low rates, which are infamously and publicly published by the artists. I'm sure you've seen these crazy things where someone has gotten 3 to 5 million plays and reaped $1.67 from it, or some outrageously low payout for this. So what does this transition from sales to stream really mean for artists? I feel that artists are still going to be feeling the pain for a while as this transition is occurring. And I hope that the artists don't just have scars to show for all this pain in the end. And perhaps only when more than 100 million people are actually paying to stream music, that won't be the case. But we know that's not around the corner with Spotify having, what, about 10 or 11 million subscribers at this point. That's really not that many in the realm of things. Let's talk about artists and the record labels. You know, I say here few, far between, and far-reaching. We know that the record labels are no longer expending large or even modest funds to support the artist unless that artist has already proven herself to be viable in the marketplace. This creates a catch-22 for the recording artist, of course, as they now must gain a high level of visibility and viability in the marketplace on their own to potentially gain a label's financial and marketing support, which it may actually not need once they do gain this high visibility and viability. So it's kind of this weird catch-22. But the issue really is that artists are forced to expend, generally, their personal funds to create the music product and on marketing. And since they must financially self-support, generally they will find themselves in a negative economic situation. Considering the huge upfront risk factors of releasing new music into the marketplace, this is a formidable obstacle for artists, and especially emerging artists with few resources to overcome. Not only that, in addition to financial self-support, each artist has to create their self-sustaining music industry business structures. Without record label support, they have to perform all the tasks that a record label normally would perform, or even a publishing company normally would perform. So these changed market conditions resulting from leveling requires artists to do two things: create excellent music and a stellar live performance, but also become their own marketers and promoters and publishers and social media people and graphic artists and designers and audio engineers and producers. And unfortunately, as we probably find out on the back end, they practice law on their own, and then we get the brunt of it. You know, fix it is always the thing, and you look and you say, are you insane? Are you over 21? Well, what do you want me to do? You know, I mean, so it's a very difficult situation for these artists right now. And it's given this rise to sort of a jack of all trades, master of none crop of artists, because you don't have time or the diligence to finally hone your art when you're doing all these other things. This is another full-time job. But there is a winning side to this, folks, and recording artists now have widespread access to digital music creation and manipulation software and technologies. We can look at GarageBand, comes preloaded in your Mac. Logic Pro Express, Pro Tools, all of these software, excellent recording and editing programs. I use them quite frequently. They're inexpensive, they're extremely efficient. And they're rapidly improving in sophistication and ease of use. So, and this is literally at the artist's fingertips. So the cost, the actual hard cost of creating and producing a decent to really good recording has sharply declined over the past few years. And this also allows artists to be their own record labels, create more recordings, and maybe even gather more intellectual property in their own right. So that's a real positive. Honestly, I talked to a major producer not that long ago who told me that on his final albums, and he produces, you know, #1 artists, said that he actually uses GarageBand tracks that are brought to him. They're that good. So that's a good thing. Let's talk about the gig money myth. Everybody says, touring monies, it'll make up for it. We're losing money in CD sales, but we're gonna go on tour. We'll make a lot of money. No, that's just not the case. First of all, let me give you a little statistic here. Just 15% of people who are consumers of music regularly go to gigs. That's the way it is. And even for these consumers, live performance consumption is, in terms of total time spent, a very small fraction of the music consumption. So the paradox is that artists still needing to make a recording in order to drive live and merchandise income, it's caught in this very odd kind of paradox. When you take a look at the live music value chain here, it's an incredibly complicated situation here. There are multiple stakeholders who take their share. There's the ticketing, there's the secondary ticketing market, there's venues, there are booking agents, promoters, all sorts of people that are taking their piece. So the share of live revenue that artists make from live performances has declined every year since the year 2000. And the secondary ticketing market is often fed before the actual ticketing market, thanks to things like bots and aggressive scalpers, or even the artists, or even the ticketing providers themselves. So again, it's they cannibalize themselves. As we probably know, knowing a lot of musicians, we know musicians play free shows, and a lot of them. But what's actually worse is for many venues, artists are now having to either pay to play the venues, actually give the venue owner money to play at that venue, or pre-sell a preset number of tickets in order to be able to play at that venue. So it's a pay-to-play situation. You can't make money that way gigging. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So finally, fan funding, crowdfunding, tip jars. Google, YouTube has a tip jar. If you want to tip your artist, it's in beta right now. You can actually tip an artist online and give them a couple of bucks if you want to do that. Can I have some more, sir? So crowdfunding, though, this fan funding, I think is a mixed bag of winning and losing. Yes, an artist can certainly raise funds for a new recording and maybe a tour, maybe make a music video. You can do that on Kickstarter, Indiegogo, any one of many of these. But the problem is that oftentimes the artist has no clear idea of what to actually do with those dollars, how to wisely spend those marketing dollars. And I have to say that 99% of that time, they do not consider lawyers' fees in those dollars. And that's where they get bollocksed up, because there are contracts to be made and deals to be made, and that's a problem. The other thing is, I was talking to an artist who is a big YouTube artist. She has really, literally, some of her videos have over 3 million hits, and she plays the ukulele. Her name's Julia Nunes, if you ever want to see somebody really fun who sings, and she's just adorable. But I was on a panel with her, and she was talking about the fact that she did not know how much it would cost her to send out all those CDs and t-shirts and little goodie bags that she promised all of her donors on the site. So she raised, let's say, I forget what the figure was, something like $30,000 to make a recording, but $5,000 of it was spent on shipping and mailing. So artists are not necessarily the best handlers of income, and that is also an issue. So who's our next player up? Oh yes, the publisher. This is where it gets a little legally heavy, and we take a look at the publisher. Are they winners in these Hunger Games, or are they losers? Well, the publisher and the publishing industry is experiencing major legal upheavals that I think will result in paradigm shifts in their business models. And this whole thing, I'm going to focus in on centering around the performing rights organizations and the relationships with technology companies, specifically Pandora, because this is very recent, and there's a lot going on there. We know that ASCAP and BMI each represent north of 500,000 songwriters and music publishers for performance rights. ASCAP and BMI, you probably know, each function under consent decrees entered into with the United States Department of Justice. These current consent decrees, among many other things, require that ASCAP and BMI must grant a license to any potential company or service that wants one. In other words, they don't have the right to say no to any potential licensee. But a major earthquake-y kind of event occurred a few years ago when EMI, April Music, decided it was going to pull its digital performance rights from the PROs, and it wanted to negotiate direct digital performance licenses with streaming services such as Spotify and Pandora. Other publishers wanted to follow this suit. Pandora was not happy with this situation. Why? You can imagine. Instead of getting the pre-existing rates that were set by the Copyright Royalty Board, now they would have to deal with EMI. And there are, I don't know how many songwriters they have and how many songs they have, but it's probably millions, directly deal with them, and the rates would be higher. So what happened was the music publishers were unhappy with the judicially set rate. I think it was 1.85% of Pandora's annual revenue. That's what it was. And I think combined, the whole combined PR rate was around 4.3%. And they felt that was really too low. And even though Pandora rate for that particular rate was slightly more than the traditional radio broadcasters pay for their ASCAP licenses, and they were also commensurate with what other streaming services were paying, services like Spotify and iTunes were paying significantly higher rates to the publishers, ranging as high as a combined 10% of annual revenue. That's a significant difference. And furthermore, I think what really irked the publishers a lot was that the rate that Pandora pays the record labels for their master rights is in the range of 50%.